I would like to share with you some insights, if you want to, on this issue of debates and results of NAFTA after 20 years. You will have the presentation. You will see there are some data, some information that you can look in detail later. No? First part, again, if you look at some of the web pages, you will find a vast literature review and a lot of work together with the public sector, the private sector, proudly being in the academic sector. No? But so I would say that this distinction between private, public, and academic is getting less and less clear. In the last years, we've been doing a lot of work on the auto parts, automobile chain, yarn, textile, garment, electronics, pharmaceutical, and so on, increasingly comparing China with some Latin American countries, and also in the context of NAFTA. The first part I will go through very quickly, just to remind you, no, where does NAFTA come from, the North American Free Trade Agreement? I would say that it is very important from a Mexican perspective, at least, to understand that NAFTA is very functional and very clearly as part of a strategy since the late 1980s, and particularly of the Salinas administration. Salinas de Gortari, we might like it or not, was probably one of the last presidents until today who had a very clear idea what Mexico should do in the short, medium, and long run. No? And so I would say that NAFTA, again, is part of this export-oriented industrialization strategy, opening up, integrating, of course, to whom? If you want to export, you have to export to your major trading partner, which is the United States. No? It would be impossible to specialize in exports to Belize, no? Which is not very relevant for Mexico, etc. No? There are a lot of other more academic discussions that I leave aside, but I would then simply say then again that NAFTA was probably necessary from a coherent perspective, from a Mexican perspective, to have a clear agenda in terms of trade and investments. No? 3 or 4 points simply to remember. Again, the main, I would say, firms and pushers behind NAFTA were, of course, multinational corporations that were already highly integrated within NAFTA. Some might remember the importance of the automobile industry, electronics, etc. Very important also is that NAFTA only includes trade, investment, and some parallel agreements that in general were not relevant. So although we might like to discuss in the process of integration between the 3 countries issues such as immigration, gender, and many other issues, this is not part of NAFTA. No? We might like to include it. No? I would remind you that institutionally, NAFTA, if you compare it with other integration processes, particularly with Europe, but also with other Latin American integration process, that NAFTA is institutionally very, very weak. No? We don't have any important institutions within NAFTA. At one point, some of us might remember NatBank. Nobody remembers it today. Younger generations, not at all. No. Who are these guys? What do they do? Why, etc. No? And again, institutionally, again, very weak. It does not include a group of topics that I mentioned here. And from a Mexican perspective, I would say it is very important to recall that there is, until 2014, not one single public analysis evaluation of NAFTA. No? Does it work? Does it not work? As you might imagine, some might applaud it more, some less, etc. Some of the friends and colleagues from here have been working, including myself, on evaluations, but publicly, contrary to the US ITC, where you have every 2 years, and on NAFTA and other FTAs, in Mexico we don't have one public assessment. What is working, what not? After 20 years, you might imagine to have some kind of discussion, not in Mexico. I simply recall, this I'm going to leave aside and simply to remind you that, of course, there were a lot of discussions in 92, 93, before the signing of NAFTA in Mexico, in the US and Canada. And I would, from CG modeling, and some participated in these discussions, I would say that in general, probably there was an agreement that this sector in Mexico that was going to close gaps, and there were different kind of gap modeling in terms of wages, in terms of GDP, of employment, of trade, of course, investments, etc. If there was a sector that was going to close some gaps from a Mexican perspective, it was going to be the manufacturing sector. No? It was clear that Mexico had huge differences in terms of the agricultural sector, and that in services Mexico was pretty weak compared to other countries, particularly the United States. No? Also relevant, as part of this NAFTA strategy, etc., I would like to recall you, many people forget this, because this is not the case in the last 5 years anymore, but Mexico was a case study, a model for many Latin American countries, also for the World Trade Organization and many others. No? There were some expectations, I say also a little bit ironically, some wild guesses, including people such as Hufbauer and Schott, on what was going to happen with NAFTA. No? It's very impressive that after 20 years, after 15 or 10 years, many of these expectations modeling, there has been very little contrast on what really happened compared to initial expectations. No? Finally, I would simply like to recall that after 20 years of NAFTA until today, there has not been one single important change within NAFTA. No? And this is very coherent from a Mexican perspective. There is always a fear that if you open up a discussion and a debate on NAFTA, the US and Canada might ask for opening in sectors such as energy and other sectors. So from a Mexican perspective, the governments from PAN and PRI have been extremely conservative. We don't want to open up a discussion. The reasons are different from a US and Canada perspective. And I would say finally, it is important to remember, to have clear at least that there are at least two broad stages within NAFTA, the NAFTA process. From 94 to 2000, there was an increasing integration process in terms, as we'll see in a moment, in terms of trade, in terms of investment. When you go to specific value-added chains, it's very clear also in terms of intra-industry trade and many other calculations that the region was integrating and developing together. Since 2000, and we have been working on this in the last years, there has been an increasing disintegration of NAFTA. No? This has a lot to do, as we'll see in a moment, with new players within NAFTA that were not expected 20 years ago. No? Finally, I would say we will probably listen today to a lot of different up and downs, no? Yo-yo economics that goes up and down and down and up, and at the end you have little analysis. No? So I would say yes, of course, trade, exports, imports of Mexico with the United States among the three countries have increased, no question. No? But that can't be all. No? In Mexico, there has been little discussion in the last years, in these last weeks also. But if there has been some, well, they would tell you, look, exports from Mexico to the United States have increased 6 times. No? So very good. Imports from the United States, as you will see it, have increased 4 times. Very positive. Trade, FDI, etc. I would say this is very simplistic and very primitive. Let's go beyond this up and downs. I put the case of Turkey, note the irony and sarcasm, no? Which means Turkey is very irrelevant for Mexico. And still, exports from Mexico to Turkey increased 5,000 times, no? Much more than NAFTA. No? So again, simply saying trade to the US increased, and so did exports, imports, and foreign direct investments, to put it politely, is not sufficient for a morally serious analysis. A couple of developments that I would like to share with you, and then I finish with some conclusions. No? In terms of GDP per capita, very broad. Someone could say this is not part of the NAFTA agenda, which is true. I would agree. The GDP gap per capita between Mexico and the United States since '94 until 2012 has not decreased but increased. No? So in 1994, Mexico's GDP accounted for 28% of US GDP. 31%, and it fell to 29%. No, so it's not a dramatic widening of the gap, but you don't have a closing gap in terms of GDP, which is not irrelevant. Very important is, again, to understand this performance, I would say, from a Mexican perspective. No? So at one point, to 1999, 2000, you have a breaking point in terms of integration within NAFTA. No? The United States accounted for 81% of Mexico's trade, 1999. Most of policymakers, but also of people in the news and people in academics, still have this picture. No? 80% of Mexico's trade is with the United States. Wrong. Note the dramatic decline of the share of the United States from a Mexican perspective. It fell by more than 17%, 64% in 2013. What is the counterpart of this? The counterpart is a new player that was not expected at the end of the 1980s, beginning of the 1990s, which is Asia and particularly China. No? So the share of Asia in these 20 years increased by 3. No? This is in terms of trade balance. You have huge imbalances, but I leave it aside. And probably the most relevant is, again, from a Mexican perspective, the dramatic fall of the United States in its share for Mexican imports. It fell from levels above 70% at the end of the 1990s to less than 50% since 2007, which means the lowest level of the US share since we have statistics, since the beginning of the 20th century. Counterpart of this, again, Asia. 1/3 today of Mexican imports come from Asia, and particularly China, 16.1% of Mexican imports. And again, with China, I could put you to sleep. This is not the topic of today, but with China, we have a problem. No? China is our second main trading partner. This is correct. Nobody expected this 20 years ago. But the trade relationship in 2013 was 10-1, which means we are importing 10 units and exporting 1. This is only the legally registered trade. If you include, we've been working on yarn and textiles and electronics, other parts that are not legally counted, to put it politely, this would be even more difficult. No? This I leave aside, but simply to have an idea that we are with Asia and the United States, Mexico is having a very different trade relationship. While 2/3 of Mexican exports to the United States are in manufacturing, auto parts, automobiles, and electronics, with Asia, and particularly with China, the trade relationship is completely different. No? With China, we're exporting copper, copper and some raw materials, which we had forgotten in Mexico that they were so relevant. And we're importing 100% manufactured goods. This I leave aside. Also, from a US perspective, I guess Ralph and others will work on this in a lot more of detail. Of course, at one point, Mexico and China competed in the US market. This is passé. We're not competing. No? If you see in the yarn, textile, garment sector, etc., you find that 10 years ago, Mexico and China had a more or less similar share. Today, the China with Hong Kong, Macau, is having almost 50% share over total US imports, Mexico's fell from 12% to 5%. So I would say again, we are not competing today. 10 years ago, maybe. Finally, I would simply invite you, there is a very easy but interesting methodology, simply to state again that the fourth uninvited guest of NAFTA, which is China, is competing head-to-head with Mexico in the US market and with the US in the Mexican market. Surprisingly, this is not a topic neither in the US nor in Mexico in terms of NAFTA integration. You could see something more or less similar regarding other issues, but I leave it aside. Some conclusions then what we see, I would say, is this process of disintegration since the 1990s of NAFTA in terms of intra-industry trade, in terms of trade, of investment. In 2002, Asia is getting very important for Mexico in terms of investment. There are a lot of studies of particularly value-added chains which show you, and I would say support a story, not only a macroeconomic story, but where you see in yarn textile garment, in electronics, in toys, with the big exception of auto parts and automobiles. If you get into my webpage, you will see 3 or 4 articles specifically on China, Mexico, possibilities of cooperation and competition also in the US. I would finally say, in terms of proposals, there is an invitation with Kevin Gallagher and other colleagues who have been working, I would say, on policies regarding a revival of NAFTA, in terms of the rules of origin, what has been happening in yarn textile garment, in auto parts, automobiles. Firms within NAFTA cannot comply with the rules of origin. Remember, some of you might remember, in terms of the automobile sector, it was 62.5%. Nobody can comply with this. Why? Because you have Asia that is getting an important supplier. So this has resulted in easy responses, which is, so we simply downgrade and lower the rules of origin from 62.5 to 60%, and you could say sarcastically up to 0%. So this is the easy way. The more difficult way would be to see why, what is going on, what can we do as a region, etc. So I would suggest that some regional institutions are important, and to support and to pose an agenda for a deepening of NAFTA. Contrary to what the United States and Mexico have been discussing of apparently TPP, the Trans-Pacific Partnership, which apparently will substitute somehow miraculously NAFTA, I would say that on the contrary, from a Mexican perspective, it makes much more sense to see what we can do with NAFTA or not, and let's forget about it. And from a NAFTA perspective, to discuss TPP. This, from a Mexican perspective, makes much more sense. This, of course, and with this I finish, is not the case in the proposal and the position of the 3 governments. No, we have had 10 days ago a meeting at Toluca, and where the issue of NAFTA was probably not even raised. Big surprise. You would have expected some discussion, something on NAFTA, 0. And so with this, I simply invite you to go through some of the documents where you will find a lot of information. Thank you very much.